Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this event. My name is Dimitri Verne, and I lead BEUC sustainability team. I will have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion. So today's event will be focusing on a long-standing battle for consumer groups in the automotive market, which is about consumer information about the real fuel consumption of cars. Drivers have been struggling for years to get reliable information about their car's fuel consumption. And this is due to several reasons. Unrepresentative test cycles, even if the situation has been improving recently, but also too lax obligation for car makers to properly communicate about fuel consumption figures. Faced with these difficulties, consumer groups have not been inactive. We've been advocating for policy changes, of course, but we also did some practical work. And today we're going to present you the outcome of a project we've been running for a few years to improve in real life the consumer information with regards to fuel consumption. After the presentation of this new tool, we will reflect on the policy takeaways and put the topic of fuel consumption in the broader context of the EU sustainable mobility strategy. So without further ado, I will now give the floor to Monique Goyens, BEUC Director General, for a short introduction and scene setting exercise. Monique, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning and welcome to all of you. I'm delighted to introduce this event. And what is the hook? In fact, in less than a week, many of us are impatiently waiting for the publication by the Commission of the proposals in the context of the Fit for 55 package. And we are expecting in this package to have quite some initiatives that are also intended to clean up the transport sector with more switching to electrification, stricter CO2 emissions, provisions on charging infrastructure, and also on use of renewable energy in transport. However, what we are fearing is that there will be one very important missing piece, which is the revision of the car labeling directive. The car labeling directive is some sort of a dinosaur of last century. It was adopted in 1999. Really last century, but in fact there were no electric cars, there were no CO2 standards, there were only very shy Euro standards. There was environment was not really high on the agenda, neither of consumers nor of policymakers, and there was no comparative tools that were websites that were available. And at the end of the day, this car labeling directive, with the flaws that Dimitri already mentioned, has led to poor information for consumers and to a huge fragmentation across the European Union, because member states have massively used the interpretation flexibility that this directive left for them. And in fact, if you want consumers to be driving or to be this part of the solution when it comes to the energy transition, to the green transition, one of the fundamentals, I call it Consumer Protection 101, is to deliver them with correct information. Clear information, adequate, easy to use, comparable information, in order for them to be able to make the best choice, not only in terms of environment, but also in terms of finances, because we more and more identify the fact that there is a correlation between, and causality to some extent, between making the sound environmental choice and at the end of the day, having also financial benefit from it, not even speaking about the health benefits. Now, we all know, I guess, many of us have a car, many of us have been buying a car, and that when you want to buy a car, in fact, you don't really have access to real life data. It is lab data, laboratory tests data, and that we all know from experience, they don't correspond to real life data. And we as consumer organizations have since many, many years really put that in the light. And we have been able to convince the European Parliament and the Council to request from the Commission to come up with a revision this year of the car labeling directive. That's why we are quite disappointed to see that it is not part of the Fit. I mean, we have not yet seen the package, but we don't expect the car labeling directive to be part of the Fit for 55 package. So we continue to push to have such a revision, But in the meantime, and that's the topic of this workshop, we have not been resting on any laurels, and we have come up and taken our fate, our destiny or the consumer destiny in our own hands with the Mile 21 project. Now, Mile, what does Mile mean? More information, less emissions. So that is very important. And this is a project that has been coordinated by our colleagues from Italy, Altro Consumo, and Luisa Giovanni, who is the Secretary General, will give you much more details in a few minutes about this project and what is at stake and what is the added value of this project in terms of informing consumers. I would just like to take 10 seconds to congratulate officially Luisa and her colleagues from Alto Consumer, because yesterday they won a marathon class action against Volkswagen in the context of Dieselgate. And it is about misleading consumers with misleading information. And the court has awarded a compensation of 200 million euro to 63,000 consumers that have been misled by information that has been given and the cheating devices that have been introduced by Volkswagen. And this means more than 3,000 euro per affected consumer. So well done and stick to your guns, Altro Consumo. This being said, what is very important is to explain to you just in a few lines why we think Mile 21 is very interesting, because it's a tool that has been set up in order to help consumers understand real world data of fuel consumption of their cars. And in fact, it can really, the way it has been formatted and designed, it can really help the Commission in finding solutions in the context of the revision that we expect to take place soon of the car labeling directive. Because the good news is this project can be easily replicated at a larger scale. And we know that there is a legislation currently that obliges car manufacturers to have onboard consumption meters that compare real world data with lab data. Those data have to be forwarded to the European Commission. Of course, we expect this to be a very complex data that are not usable by consumers. But if you apply the format of Mile 21 to these data that are going to be available anyway to the Commission, this would be really a major step in the right direction to empower consumers to be properly informed when they want to make sound, environmentally friendly car choices. This being said, I leave the floor to a very, very interesting presentation by my colleagues from Alto Consumo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monique. And I now hand over the floor to Luisa to tell us more about this Mile 21 project and the results.
Thank you very much, Dimitri and Monique, for this very warm welcome. It's my pleasure really to introduce actually one of my first European project, because when I started, let's say, my job as looking for funds to match consumers' priorities, it was 2017 actually when this project started. And it was a pleasure for me to work with the partners of this project, which is led, by the way, by the University of Salonico. And it's about, as Monique explained, more information and less emissions, because actually these two things are combined, but it's not easy to really, translate and change consumer behavior. So the challenge that we had ahead was really to engage consumers, not just to inform. This was actually not in the title, but you will discover soon. Next slide, please. This is about, as I said, providing informations, but about what? About the real fuel consumption data, which was not necessarily the one declared by the manufacturers, and offer a simple way to compare this with the real data on the road, but also to challenge a bit also consumers in changing maybe sometimes even the driving styles, which could be also have an impact in the emissions and in the consumption. And this is through a way that allow users to keep track of their fuel use, but also offer them alternatives, because you will see that another pillar that we develop thanks to Mile 21 is a car selector to look for a new greener car. Let's go to the next slide and discover which are the partners. Apart from, of course, the Salonico University and Imisia, there are ICCT colleagues also represented here, and apart from Altro Consumo, there are also Teste Sha, OCU, and Ecoproteste. And this means that if you go to the next slide, the platform, let's say, this is the reason why we actually did this work, which was what mentioned by Monique before, because there was this dramatic gap between the real world and the official data, which was measured also by colleagues and partners ICCT, as you can see straight away, because starting from 2001, there was a gap between what the manufacturers declare of 8% up to 39% in the end in 2070, which means that this incredible gap of roughly 40% in terms of what does really my car consume is, and actually which kind of emission I do emit into the environment is really unbelievable. And that's why we felt the urgency of really aggregating in a way with thanks to mathematical models, the data coming from the real world and the data coming from the manufacturer. And thanks to the algorithm, we were able to deliver to consumer the answer about what their car is really emitting in the environment. And if you go to the next slide, you will see that, let's say, this website, mile21.eu, has been developed already with an European approach in English, German, French, and fully integrated in Altro Consumo platform, OCU platform, Deco platform, Teste Sha platform mini, that is also available in Spanish, Italian, Flemish. And as was mentioned before, we already replicated it in Greece and in Greek, therefore, and in North Macedonia. So we are also tackling the Balkans, and Poland will come soon. So the aspect of replicability means that we are aiming at really be a game changer in the behavior of both consumers and car manufacturers, hopefully, to really benefit the consumers and the environment. If you go to the next slide, this is in a nutshell what does the self-reporting tool means. If you, let's say, first of all, you register on the platform, and therefore you track your car and consumption. So you actually insert first refuel up to 3. And then you can compare your on-road consumption with the value declared by the manufacturer and the value generated by Mile 21 platform. And third step, you can, of course, change your behavior thanks to the green advice provided by the platforms. We've also realized several very nice tips and video pills that you will actually discover. I encourage you to discover on Mile 21 platform, also together with the video made by some ambassadors who actually share their experience about the usage of this self-reporting tool. If you go to the next slide, and this is the result. Actually, you have, after the 3 refuel, the 3 tanks, you receive, let's say, and see the history of how many kilometers, the odometers, the liters that you actually are putting in, and actually the emissions. And after the 3 tanks, after the track phase, if you go to the next slide, you will discover the result with the advice of Mile 21. Zara, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, is your compare your consumption, and you see your consumption of 7 liters, the estimated consumption by 6.7 liter made by mile 21, and the declared consumption, which is actually very, very lower, of 4.7 liters declared by the manufacturer. In this case, this was just an example, Kia Picanto, which means that your consumption is higher than expected. And so we challenge consumer to improve the driving style. And meaning that, okay, you go ahead and in the next slide, and you see that activating what we call the challenge. So we really try to engage people to really start in implementing some good advice, which could also be just stop using your car for a short distance, because we found out that people most of the time just use their cars for distance of 5 kilometers, which is a no sense. Okay, so it's also trying to shape a new mindset in people's heads, and keep a regular driving style, keep maybe your back of the car empty, or just inflate your the wheels in order not to lose fuel, but meaning that it's not just about not very accurate declaration manufactured. It's sometimes also about creating awareness about what we can do for the environment. So the effort we made was to really put into the consumer's feet. If you go ahead, I will show you, okay, the improvement. In the end, after activating the challenge, you can see that you can, at the beginning, there was a consumption higher than expected. And after following the green advice of, let's say, of consumers of mile 21, your consumption will be lower than estimated. And again, you will emit, if you go to the next slide, let's say, less CO2 in the environment, and you will also save liters of fuel. So this is, I think, in a nutshell, the core of the project. But if you go to the next slide, you will discover the second pillar, which is the compare tool. A compare tool is a kind of really huge database mapping cars since 2013. Okay, and it's again a way to support consumers in selecting the most efficient car. Also, at the momentum now is really quite important for the car sector to really make a change, but also to help consumers towards this transition. We prepare this database, so you can select depending on your needs and the car segment you want, the powertrain you want, and you can select the cars and really make an easy, affordable choice, but looking at the environment again, because we are highlighting CO2 emissions again and all the features of the cars, but again, to make the greener choice and the most sustainable one, the easier one, as much as possible. If you go ahead, these are the key data that we achieve in 9-month work together with colleagues. We got so far, actually the data are, we took a picture at the end of June. So we have 8,511 registered people, which I look at the platform before. At the bottom, you will find that they've now increased at 600,000. So I'm quite happy about it, but these are people registered to the platform. Of these 8,500, at least, let's say 570.99 registered at least one car, and some registered more than one car. So 393 are the cars registered, the vehicles registered. The number of refuel events that I was mentioning before to the platform already are 7,070. You have also to consider that COVID impacted our project as well. So you can imagine that the lockdown didn't make us travel a lot. So there's a kind of delay in moving and delay in registering. We are also improving the platform with shortcuts to make it available on the mobile phone. But in the end, all in all, we have the final figures of 854 consumers. We mount their free refuel events, which actually are the ones benefiting the most already from the advice of the platform. And so I think this is the real core of the achievements and engagement. So it's not only information, is engagement, and engagement through user-generated content by users, okay? So our user data actually combined, thanks to the algorithm, to the data coming from the manufacturers, and actually enabling this platform, thanks to the intelligence and the knowledge of our research partners, to provide this tool enabling the change, okay? The green change towards a greener mobility. If you go to the next slide. And this is the reason why I'm quite proud of sharing with you. We decided to candidate this website, which is a mild project, it's a live project, candidate to the URID website award nomination. And I really hope that after having not listened to me, but use the platform, it will be a supporter of the Better Work category nomination and vote for Mile 21 to be the winner in terms of game changer for a better environment and a real consumer engagement in relation to the sustainability goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luisa. You ended with a nice campaign call. So everyone, please vote for Mile 21. You made good points, Luisa. This is much more than a mere information tool. There is this training feature, which is essential to get people to lower their fuel consumption, and also this comparison tool, which is also one of the strong suits of consumer organizations, of course. And I also take away the point that the best way to reduce your fuel consumption is probably to avoid taking your cars for trips, which you can do with other means, such as walking or even biking. So we'll now move to the second part of the session, and we'll discuss the policy takeaways of this project, but more broadly of consumer information with regards to fuel consumption. But before doing that, I just want to give a few, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of this conference. Attendees won't be able to take the floor, but you're all invited to share your questions on the chat. So don't wait for the Q&A to start sharing your thoughts or your questions. You can start already now. And now I will give the floor to Peter Mock from the ICCT, International Council on Clean Transportation, and he will tell us about how consumer information can help boost the impact of stricter CO2 standards for cars. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. I prepared a few slides that we hopefully can see in a minute. And I would like to start basically with a success story. I want to take a look at what track are we currently on, how are CO2 emissions from new cars developing in Europe, and then later go towards where do we actually have to be, what track should we be on. While we're waiting for the slides, I will thank my colleagues, Sonsoles Diaz, Georg Bieker, Jan Dornoff. They have all been involved in the underlying work here. So next slide, please. What you see here is a chart of the new passenger car CO2 emissions in Europe, the average emissions according to the test procedure. This is still in the old NEDC test procedure, but it's like just handy for comparing the historic values. And I think it's helpful to see for what track are we currently on. And you see that we had different phases of the regulations. We had a pre-regulation phase where CO2 emissions didn't decrease very much. We had the first phase of the regulation where emissions decreased by about 3.5% per year. Then we had the first part of the second regulation after 2015, when the 2015 target had been met. Nothing really happened. Emissions of vehicles actually even increased. And then we had the very impressive year 2020, when emissions suddenly decreased drastically. Here in the chart, you can see that emissions went down by about 20%. That's including the credits. If you leave the credits aside, it's only 12%, but even that is a very impressive reduction within 1 year. So my takeaway is, or my message I want to send here is that it's possible. Manufacturers can reduce the emissions of their vehicles quickly within 1 year, as we have seen, but it has to be kind of pushed by regulation, by the CO2 standards, which I think provide a very strong push for manufacturers to provide and market the vehicle models that help to reduce emissions. And in parallel, it needs also a pull from the consumer side. It needs fiscal policies, it needs consumer information. And I'll get back to this later on. I think in 2020, we've seen that it worked very well. Those two policies together, the CO2 proposal had a strong deadline for 2020 to meet a certain target. And we also saw a lot of fiscal incentives in many member states. But it has only been in 2020 so far. And really, in the years before, the decrease was slower, and also for the years to come. If we stick with the current policies, with the currently adopted policies for 2025 and 2030, we are kind of almost returning to the old pathway. We are not keeping the strong decrease in emissions that we have seen in 2020. With that, please, to the next slide. Where do we actually have to go? What track do we need to be on? This comes from a modeling that we have carried out at ICCT using our modeling tools. You can find the full report on our website, of course. And what we did here is we looked at 4 different scenarios. The first one is the adopted policy scenario, so the current policies in place. And then we have 3 ambition scenarios. And we look at 2030 and 2050 in terms of emissions. So if you look at the very right-hand side, the 2 last columns, those are the emission reduction that we would see from road transport overall in all of these scenarios. And you can see that most of the numbers are red. So this is not enough to be in line with the Green Deal targets or with the 2030 overall economy targets. It's only the green ones, the moderate ambition and the high ambition scenario, that would reach the Green Deal targets for 2050. And in order to get there, what we would need, and this is more on the left-hand side, for new cars, what we would need is a reduction of CO2 emissions of at least 70% by 2030. So right now we have 37.5% as a target for 2030. We would need to basically double that target to at least 70% by 2030 in order to get there for 2050. So the good message is that we can still get on track, but it needs action from the European Commission side and then also Parliament member states to really strengthen the current ambition level that we have in the regulation. Side note is that for 2030, it doesn't look good at all. So even in the high ambition scenario, we would miss the 2030 targets, but at least for 2050, we can still make it. Next slide, please. How do we get there? So what kind of technologies would us bring to those necessary reductions? We also have a detailed paper on this. The key message or the core takeaway message is that we need to electrify, and it is mainly the battery electric vehicles, maybe fuel cell vehicles, but certainly battery electric vehicles that would bring us the necessary reductions and would also bring us the reductions in a cost-efficient way that would also benefit consumers. So this here, the graph shows the consumer perspective. These are the additional total cost of ownership compared to a vehicle today. And total cost of ownership include not only the investment for the vehicle, but also fuel cost savings, electricity, charging costs, and so on and so forth. And what you can see for 2021 is that pretty much all the electric technologies are still more expensive than the conventional technology. So in the case of a battery electric vehicle, small battery electric vehicle, it's around 7,000 euros. So that's about the level of subsidies paid in many countries at the moment, and explains why it's still attractive to buy such an electric vehicle for some consumers at the moment, but this is because of subsidies. By 2025, the picture already looks different. So if you focus again on the battery electric vehicle with 350 kilometers of range, that vehicle by 2025, we estimate, would be cost efficient even without subsidies for an average consumer. So the message is actually very positive. I think that costs will decrease for battery electric vehicles significantly, and it will also be a very cost efficient pathway to reduce emissions from a consumer perspective. Actually, in our modeling, what we found is that the more we reduce CO2 emissions for new vehicles, the more consumers save. So that's a very good message that your consumer protection and environmental protection go hand in hand. Let's move to the next slide. So that was about the standards in particular, but there's also other measures. So how do we get there? Not in terms of technologies, but now in terms of policy measures. And here I want to emphasize my perspective that it really needs a strong package. It's not CO2 standards and either fiscal policies, consumer information, it's all together. So CO2 standards have to be accompanied by fiscal policies, usually at the national level. So here you see the example for Germany, where at the moment we have, I think, quite generous government support from, if you buy a battery electric vehicle in Germany, you get 6,000 euros from the government at the moment, and another around 3,000 euros from the manufacturer. So that makes the vehicles really attractive at the moment. But for the future, you have to make sure that these sorts of subsidies are counterfinanced, for example, by a bonus-malus system, and that we also find a way out of these subsidies and do not continue forever with these. And then the third pillar for me is really consumer information. And we've just seen MAL21 presented by Luisa. That's a powerful tool, I think, or has the potential to develop in a very powerful tool for informing consumer. At the point of purchase, so before the consumer selects a vehicle or while the consumer selects a vehicle, that is really a benefit of this MAL21 tool, that it can inform the consumer at the point of purchase, and maybe not only about what sort of vehicles are interesting, but I think it would also be very helpful to have information about what kind of subsidies are available, what do I need in terms of charging infrastructure, all these things, everything that the consumer really needs at the point of purchase to decide for a low emission vehicle. But it's not only at the point of purchase that consumer information is very important, and that brings me to the next slide. It's also during the use phase of the vehicle. So here you see a similar chart that Luisa just showed. So that's the divergence between the official CO2 values for new vehicles and what we get reported as real world usage values. And you can see that the gap has increased over the years, but then luckily kind of stabilized, and eventually now it's decreasing. And with the WLTP, you see that in green, we only have one data point so far that we could analyze for 2018 vehicles, but that data point looked promising. So maybe because of the new test procedure and other measures, it looks like the gap has been decreasing or will decrease in the next years. So that's a very positive development, but it was only possible because we had consumer information. So we had all this data from consumers reporting what is the real world fuel consumption of their vehicles. Only because of this, we could analyze such data and we could really point to the problem. And ultimately, we could all together fix that problem by introducing a new test procedure and other measures. So consumer data can help and is very important, not only at the point of purchase, but also during the use phase. And brings me to the last slide, really. We have now a very good tool introduced by the European Commission that can add more data to this. So we have the onboard fuel consumption meters, which are now mandatory for new vehicles and which allow the vehicles or users in the end to report real world data basically in real time to the authorities. And that's a very powerful tool that I think is going to be used and is going to be very important for the future, but only if we have that data available. So only if that data is transparent and accessible also in a relatively detailed format to all of us. So as conclusions on the next slide, my key messages really are that we need to do much more. New vehicle CO2 emissions need to decrease by at least 70% by 2030, so that we are on track for the Green Deal. And CO2 standards provide an important push from manufacturers, but they need to be complemented with a pull for consumers. And that pull includes fiscal incentives, but also includes consumer information at the point of purchase. So for example, using MAL21, using labeling, but also during the use phase. And that's where onboard fuel consumption meter data is extremely important. And this is a recommendation to the European Commission mostly. The data coming from those fuel consumption meters should be published as soon as possible and as detailed as possible, so that it will be useful for us analysts and then in the end also for consumers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thanks a lot for setting this wider regulatory scene. We see the market will move a lot in the coming years, and your figures are quite impressive with regards to what levels of CO2 reduction we need to reach to reach our climate ambition, and what impact it will have on the electrification of the car market. So maybe with this in mind, I would like to ask Franz Kreil from our Austrian member Arbeiterkammer Wien to comment maybe on this aspect with a focus on what are his takeaways for the reform of the famous car labeling directive, this dinosaur that Monique mentioned at the beginning of the event. Franz,
Excellent. So good morning from Vienna, and thank you very much for the kind invitation and to talk about the fuel and electricity consumption issue. My name is Franz Kreil, and I'm policy officer at the Arbeiterkammer. The Arbeiterkammer is the legal representation of employees and consumers in Austria. We have about 3.7 million members. We provide basic services to our member, but do also basic research. And the linkage between our organization and the fuel consumption issue is we have many commuters. Our members need to get to work, and our estimation is that 2/3 of our members have to take the car to get to work, and therefore fuel consumption is a real big issue in Austria, even in the context of the EU climate goals. Our expectations are that the fuel costs will be higher for our members in the near futures, and even in the context of the Fit for 55 package. Could you please go back? Yeah, I want to start with the Fit for 55 issue. Next week, the Commission will present a huge package of legislative proposals. This package has so many proposals I can even enumerate, but there's one big absentee from our perspective, namely a new proposal for a regulation for harmonized car and car labeling schemes in Europe. I feel I'm a bit disappointed because we still think that good and accurate information is at the very heart of a consumer's choice, and the consumer should get the information. But unfortunately, this isn't the case. Next slide, please. Just to bring it down to earth and to make it transparent, which kind of information do you get nowadays in Austria? Yesterday, I consulted the official car labeling website in Austria, and I just took by poor accident a Tesla model, and I've put it on one slide, all information you can get now by law, and all that you can get is the kilowatt per 100 kilometers, and the information that you generate 0 gram CO2 on your way to the journey. And the official rating is for this Tesla is the best official rating you get. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to blame the car maker for this kind of information, because the car makers have to fulfill the framework that is provided by the national and the European legislature. We feel electric cars should have a role in the future for a sustainable mobility. We think electric cars are useful in a certain mobility mix, combined with public transport, cycling, and walking. But we think if we want to move our members to make more sustainable choices, they should get more information. We think the range is still a very big issue, And if I had more time to talk about charging, I could tell you, I think about 15 minutes, how complicated it is to find out what is the real cost of 1 kilowatt per hour at a public charging station. When we talk about more sustainable transport means, we think an average consumer should get at first sight an average figure number. What is the cost for electricity consumption, but also, of course, for fuel cost for combustion engine cars. And I think it would be quite useful if we have running costs, because we think carpooling could play a very useful role in the future to reach EU climate targets, and running costs could be a starting point for our members to think about this mobility option. The last point is a very big point for me, because we started to think about, I think 3 years ago, when we published, when we commissioned a study at the Federal Agency for the Environment in Austria, when we tried to get the real CO2 footprint of electric cars. Next slide, please. The official information you get when you buy an electric car is 0 emission, but here I've enlisted all the most selling electric cars in Austria. And if you take the total CO2 footprint, the picture is, I think, is quite brighter. And you know, and you see, I think at first sight that that there's a huge difference for every electric cars. My focus on electric car is the reason why we are focusing on electric cars is because we expect a huge rise in the selling numbers in the next years. We think it is quite useful, but as things stand right now, the future choices for electric cars could go in the wrong direction. In our mind, there should be a difference between a Smart 42 with about 42 gram CO2 and a Tesla Model XP. Next slide, please. I saw this labeling scheme in a conference 7 years ago, and I was quite puzzled about the features of this scheme. This is the labeling scheme of the United States, and much to my surprise, I think the consumers in the United States get quite useful information. They can see at first sight how many, what is the combined consumption figures in city on a highway. And I think what's even more important for me, you can see on the corner top right, the saving one consumer can make if he makes a certain choice. And what even Donald Trump managed to do is in the United States, there's one agency that is in charge of market surveillance and of labeling. And if a car producer in the United States doesn't comply with the official figures you can see here on this label, he has to face really tough and severe sanctions. And I think that could be a useful lesson for Europe, because after all these years, I'm concerned with this consumption issues. I still don't know who is in charge for market surveillance in Europe or in my country. And I want to leave it like this. And just one last quote. I'm quite thankful to the MILE 21 project and to the ICCT studies, because our starting point 7 years ago was really based upon these kind of studies. We started with www.spritmonitor.de, and these consumer figures were the first real database to bring this issue forward to the Commission and to our officials in the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franz, also for sharing this nice benchmark of how the good and well-functioning car labeling could look like. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Diogo. Diogo, who is Policy Director at the Automobile Club FIA Region 1, to share also his perspectives on drivers' expectations with regards to fuel consumption figures and information.
Thank you, Dimitri, and good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me today. And apologies from Lauriane, our Director General, who would have liked to be here on instead of me, but because she's so ahead of us and she's already participating in physical meetings involving traveling, she was victim of the difficulties of traveling and was not able to be here today. So I'm happy to step in. The first thing I wanted to tell you is that to congratulate the previous speakers and to say very clearly that I agree with most of what they say, and I support most of what they say. So in my presentation, instead of repeating what they said, I will try to focus on the things that maybe we diverge a little bit, so that to see other sides of the discussion. Just to start with, I mean, of course, FIA is known for very fancy stuff like Formula 1 racing, but I don't do that kind of things. And what we do in FIA Region 1 is actually dealing with the clubs, what we call the mobility clubs within FIA. So organizations that represent users, drivers at the national level. And you have a bit of a picture of what we represent and where we are present in Europe here. Next slide, please. So what we do is to work on different issues. There are main 4 areas of our work that we try to focus on in terms of making the link between our members at the national level and the EU institutions. Connecting vehicles is of course an important issue. We just last week sent a common letter together with BEUC about some of these things. I invite you to read. Of course, we talk a lot. We focus also a lot on the issues of safeguarding mobility, what we call supporting efficient and affordable mobility for all. Road safety, very important aspect of our work. And last but not least, protecting the environment. And this is where we will focus today, trying to develop ways of and intelligent ways of making the impact of transport in the environment to be mitigated. Next slide, please. So what our vision is indeed to create a mobility that is safe, sustainable, and affordable for all. In that sense, reducing car emissions is essential. We want to make sure that we reach the 2050 climate neutrality objective, and we believe that in order to do that, consumers must be fully considered. The decision makers must put mobility users first. and provide them with the tools to reduce the emissions. And because of that, one of important aspect is, of course, that motorists need to feel confident about the fact that their cars actually deliver the advertised emission values, and therefore the aspects that we have already covered here today are really important in terms of information for the consumers. But as it was already mentioned, it's not only about informing them, it's also about educating them to be able and make them engage themselves in contributing to this reducing of emissions. We also believe that reducing emissions at the source is the best way to deal with this, and therefore we try to focus on those aspects. Next slide, please. So what we feel in terms of how we see the way forward is a combination of different aspects. For us, the technological and natural approach to decarbonization is very important. As it was hinted, namely in the previous intervention, developing a life cycle assessment methodology is fundamental also to give the real information for people. We want to support actions that make vehicles cleaner, but at the end of the day, and this is today focus, giving consumers reliable information on their environmental footprint is essential to achieve our objectives. Next slide, please. So, I mean, we do believe a lot on everything what has been said about real world and fuel or energy consumption, but we also believe that there are some constraints to this. I mean, there are some methodological issues. One of the things is, of course, the repeatability and the reproducibility of these things. I mean, as Louisa mentioned, it is difficult to evaluate unless people actually contribute also with several episodes of refueling or recharging. We need to track this on a continuous basis and make sure that we have enough data that can be translated into real information, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of things that a lot of factors that influence this consumption, and of course some of them have to do with the driving style, have nothing to do with the consumption of the vehicle itself. It has to do with the places, with the environmental conditions in which the driving is done, and so on and so forth. So there are some constraints, and the more data we have, the more we will be able to mitigate these constraints and use the real data for our policy remarks. Next slide, please. So what we are trying to do is to mitigate these concerns by developing harmonized test procedures between labs, and also the use of reference fuel. Of course, fuels are different also. That creates some difficulties for the comparisons. We are trying to, let's say, normalize the variables to control these repeatability and reproducibility issues. I mean, some of them are unavoidable. We are trying to find out. But of course, one of the main when the concerns we have is that we tend to express fuel or energy consumption in a single average value, and sometimes this is not really the most accurate way of doing it from the scientific technical perspective. So we are trying also to look at it more as a range of values rather than as an average, which creates a bit of an issue. Next slide, please. So what we are trying to do, and I want to focus so much on the aspects that have already been covered of the engagement of consumers themselves. It's also about informing them with things, and we are part of this project of the Green NCAP. You probably know NCAP through the more established projects in terms of safety, but we are trying to develop this Green NCAP sector, which looks into the energy consumption and the way we can consider cars actually green, let's say. And the objective is to provide comprehensive, but at the same time simple information to consumers. Of course, behind it, there's a lot of very detailed technical information that can be used by experts. But what would be interesting is to be able to give the consumers this very simple way of that NCAP used the stars rating, where we could say, well, this car, it's 5 stars, this car is only 2 stars, and then people can find other information behind the stars, let's say. We look at this from 2 perspectives. One is the clean air, what we call the clean air index, and the other one is the energy efficiency index, and combined this will show into a star rating. Next slide, please. This, I mean, I'm not gonna show you more, but the idea is that this also creates a situation where we can compare the energy consumption of different vehicles, be it electric or ICE, so that you can actually compare one to the other. So the different propulsion systems are actually comparable. But for this, what we do is that the fuels used on the ICEs are converted to energy content, and this then allows for the creation of thresholds where you can use to complement the real world results that projects like the Mile 21.
Diogo, sorry to jump in, but
yeah.
We want to leave a bit of time for the Q&A. So if you could.
Yeah, I'm finished.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
I will finish if you move to the next slide. Which is the last. So I just wanted to give you the perspective into the future of this green NCAP that you can, of course, check here out for yourselves on the website. There will be still quarterly releases until the end of the year. We are, of course, trying to use the cars that are listed according to the consumer's interests and the sales and so on and so forth. For 2022, what we are trying to do is to introduce a dynamic tool of life cycle assessment that looks into the well-to-wheel consumption and not only the tailpipe gas emissions, and this would allow consumers to obtain these ranges that I mentioned for the vehicle and be able to compare to others. So this is just an example of the things that can be done and that we are trying to do in order indeed to inform and also educate the consumers to reach the objectives. Thank you.
Thanks, Diogo, and sorry for interrupting you. That's really interesting. Your presentation highlighted the challenges with regards to technical testing of fuel consumption, but also thanks for highlighting this green NCAP project. Several BEUC members also participating to this, and this is quite a promising tool. So we'll now move to the Q&A. I see there were some reactions, especially from Laurent Schmidt, who asks how electric cars will be integrated to Mile 21, if this is foreseen. And he also asks whether the Mile 21 tool, how it's working or collaborating with other platforms, such as maybe Spritz Monitor or the Green NCAP indeed, and whether there is a project or interoperability of data to establish some benchmarks. So I guess these questions would be rather for Luisa.
Yes, Dimitri, thank you. I already mentioned in the chat that we expanded the scope of Mile 21, which at the beginning was not actually aimed at covering electric cars and hybrid, but we did because we thought it was the future. And for sure, I think we will in the future, because the project is turning to an end, but this should rather be a starting point, in my opinion. Both cooperate with other platforms, which we have been already doing, and exchanging data with Green NCAP to be part of this life cycle analysis with the user's data, as mentioned, but also calculate the footprint also of electric cars. And I was also thinking to what Peter was saying before, because we run other projects about electric cars journey in several of our Euroconsumer countries, tackling obstacles in terms of infrastructure to support these actually kind of transition towards the green mobility, and tackling also the topic of the total cost of ownership mentioned, because the point is really offering a full picture to consumers of what is, let's say, the best possible choice and also the most sustainable one for real. And bringing here the data of our search that we share and debate with BEUC as well at the conference at I think was the end of April. For example, you discover that you know, plug-in hybrid is not so convenient in terms of total cost of ownership. I'd rather go to electric ones directly, but this means that the infrastructure should be ready. And therefore, the aim, in a nutshell, of Mile 21 is really pushing for interaction with other platforms to really implement the change and make it available for everyone, also for manufacturers, because I think car manufacturer will face a lot of challenges in terms of, okay, side effects such as reconversion of plants and employment as well. But I think consumers and users and drivers should not be put, Diogo, at the end of the cycle, but rather be part of the life cycle assessment. So it's there that we can really make a difference together. And the other way around, so be ready to offer greener model by default, because we cannot just rely on incentives, because then in the end, incentives became tax in a way. So now we have the famous Green Deal plan and recovery plan, but I do think the demand and offer should really match. And to do that, we have now the digital platform that will enable us. So we are there to gather consumers, to support them, but I think we should work together. Thank you, Dimitri.
Thanks, Luisa. And yeah, you mentioned the economic dimension, the total cost of ownership, which is also one key piece of information beyond energy use, beyond the range that needs to be more clearly communicated to people. And that was also what the United States label seems to indicate. Now, I would have a question to Peter, maybe more on the regulatory side. You mentioned, Peter, during your presentation, the onboard fuel consumption meters that the EU will make use of to monitor the gap between real-world emissions and laboratory tests. Do you think that the current legislation is sufficient? And are you confident that the data which will be collected will be made available via national authorities and car makers?
The latter is my concern. So I think the regulation itself is very good and very important. And it's good to see that those fuel consumption meters now are mandatory, that the data is being collected, that manufacturers provide this data to the authorities. That's all good. But from what I know, the regulation is simply not specific enough. We don't know how the data will be published. And it makes a huge deal if at the end of the monitoring period, we only receive basically one average value telling us this is the average fuel consumption for all the vehicles, or if that number is differentiated by manufacturer, by vehicle type, by model type, and so on and so forth. That makes a huge deal because the aggregated value is pretty much useless. Whereas the detailed data would enable all of us to understand much better where are the differences, what are the roots for differences, and what can be done about them. And yeah, again, my worry is that the regulation is not specific enough on this, and I haven't heard any clear indications of what kind of data we can expect from the European Commission. And I'm just a bit worried that we are waiting all this time, and of course it takes some time to collect the data, to prepare the data, that's all clear, but we're waiting all this time, and then in the end we may be disappointed that we don't receive detailed data that we can use for analysis.
Thanks, Peter. So it's indeed a message we need to be beyond the general targets and the general ambition of the regulatory framework, there are indeed very technical things that might be a bit less attractive for the public debate, but that needs to be clearly communicated to the EU institutions. Maybe to pursue on the regulatory aspect, I would have a question to Monique. So we've heard a lot about the reform of car labeling from different speakers. What would be, in your view, the key requirements for the next car labeling or for the revision of the car labeling directive to bring to consumers?
Well, I mean, the major recommendation from our side would be to say, keep it simple. I mean, people don't understand sophisticated figures and Excel tables and this type of very dense information. So take as a source of inspiration the energy label, for example, that is very successful and that has also helped consumers really understand the energy consumption of their appliances and has promoted innovation in that sector. But well, there should be, of course, quite some information that should be put in an attractive way on that label. It's about real fuel consumption. It's about real CO2 emissions. It's about running costs. It's about emissions of regulated pollutants. It's about the test cycle under which it has been type approved. And for electric cars, as you already mentioned, Dimitri, of course, you need to have the real electric range, not the lap range. Or, you know, it's really something that needs to be reassuring for people because it's one of the major worries that people have. It's the range, the charging speed, and the average charging time that people need in order to have a fueled car, if I can say so. It should be a regulation rather than a directive, so that we have a harmonized system in place at European level. And it should also contain a correction factor, like it has been done in the United States, to bring laboratory tests closer to reality. But it's very important also, because that's currently not so much the case also in other sectors. It has, of course, to apply to new cars, but also to second-hand cars and to leased cars, because it's an information that people need to know at any time when they are purchasing or using a car, and of course also vans and two-wheelers. And a very important element, and it has also been mentioned already, it should not only be about the fuel aspect of the car, but also about the overall environmental and carbon footprint of the vehicle. So it's quite, I mean, it's of course a challenge to make that attractive and simple, but it's very important to have the information available for the consumers.
Thanks, Monique. And yes, indeed, with the switch of the market to even more electric vehicles, this information is really very, very much needed. So I have a follow-up question on the data aspect from Laurent Schmidt, who asks whether the drivers will be able to access data from the onboard fuel consumption meter, I guess, as well for their driving efficiency, so not only the authorities. So maybe I'll ask this one to Diogo, and I would also ask you about this data from onboard fuel consumption meter, whether it can be used more, for instance, to feed into the green end cap label that you just described us.
Definitely, that's a really important issue. I think that Peter made it very clear. I mean, the regulation itself seems, I mean, the regulatory aspects seem to be okay on the paper. And now the question is how it's going to be working in real life. I mean, it's we share a lot of the questions that Peter asked. We share the concerns about how is it going to work in practice, how is the information going to be produced, how is it going to be accessed. The question is good. I mean, we normally, as a driver with our own car, have the access to that information, but how is it going to be produced for the consumers in general, this information? If it's totally aggregated and expressed in an average value, I share the concern of Peter. It's not really useful. It will have to be much more detailed than this. And of course, the question is still around the over-the-air communication also, because there's an issue there that there's a potential there, because if we do it only when if we only collect the data at technical inspections or situations like this, it won't be as regular and as spread as we would like to have. So it would be important to find ways of using also the over-the-air possibilities. Of course, there are issues that need to be addressed, but it would be a very important step in this direction. At the end of the day, the information will not only help in imposing the regulation, but it will contribute definitely to educate the consumer and to help the consumer push themselves for the good solutions, and this will have a tremendous effect in terms of achieving our objectives.
Okay, thanks, Diego. So we're coming to the end of this conference, but maybe just a short last question for Franz. So we know the EU has been struggling to make car makers pay for the Dieselgate scandal, although we had good news yesterday evening with on the Italian front. What can be done to make sure that consumers are not fooled again when it comes to fuel consumption data? If you can give us your view in 30 seconds, Franz.
Okay, I will be very brief, and I just want to mention one word: market surveillance. All EU member states and the European Commission is obliged to do market auditing by law. Every member state has a certain quota to check, and I just want to highlight, on paper it's quite clear, but I really don't know what is the outcome of this testing, and how is the degree of transparency? Which kind of information do we get as consumers from this testing? Will it be done behind closed door, or do we have full access? That's my message. Thank you, Dimitri.
Very clear message, and indeed, Franz, our nice and ambitious regulation are only as good as enforcement is. So, and that's a key battle of consumer groups, as Luisa showed us also yesterday evening. So, Monique, I will now hand over the floor to you for the concluding remarks. Yes,
thank you very much, Dimitri. And thank you for moderating so well. Just a few finishing sentences, maybe. We hear a lot about the digitalization of our markets and of our societies, and the data aggregation that to which this leads. But this data can also be used for the common good if it's well designed. And this is indeed really what Mile 21 has been demonstrating. The good use of data can be for the benefit of society, of people, and even of the environment. And Mile 21 should be a source of information for the upcoming car labeling, hopefully, regulation, because it is not everything. You cannot empower consumers just by throwing information at them. You need to format this information in a way that it is usable for them. And what I would say, the next step that Mile 21 has given to us, it's not only a good, attractive format of data, but it's also engaging consumers, as has been said, through gamification. I mean, if you see that you're not as good as your neighbor, you want to do something against that. And that is also a way to mobilize consumers in order to be part of the solution in the green transition. So that is certainly something that might also be integrated by the policymakers when rolling out the green transition with the support of consumers. And what is very important, as we don't have any time to waste. It's now or never. There will be still consumers for the next years to come that will buy non-electric vehicles, that will buy petrol or diesel cars, and they will need to be able to rely on information on fuel consumption and the other elements that are important for their choice, and that need this information to be reliable, easily accessible, in order to be able to play their part. And there is a political momentum now, and we should not be waiting for another 20 years for the car labeling directive to get out of the dinosaur age and to be future-proof. And if well designed, this car labeling regulation can steer consumers into more sound environmental decisions. And at the end of the day, if the consumers move the market, car manufacturers will be nudged to provide cleaner cars and more efficient cars. And that's at the end of the day what we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monique. So that's the moment to close this event. I want to thank the panelists first and everyone for attending the event. I'd like to encourage you once again to go on Mile 21 website to maybe test it yourself if you have a car. And to vote for it if you're convinced, which I'm sure you will be. Yeah, you can count on the policy side, on consumer groups, to keep engaging on this. And as Monique said, to size the momentum to push for regulatory action on better consumer information with regards to fuel consumption and energy consumption of electric cars as well. Thank you, and have a good day, everyone.